The subject of tonight's message is the God of Abraham. It's a very, very important title. And in a way, this message is to unpack this name, the God of Abraham, that is mentioned quite often in the Bible, but without content. And so this message gives the content to the God of Abraham. And the first thing is I want you to dwell on this title, the God of Abraham. And it's not an insignificant thing. In fact, if you consider it, it is very significant that this God, who is the God that all the three major religions in the world worship, is a God of a single person, a God of, in fact, a quite insignificant person. Today, if you go to the Middle East, you can find edifices of kings, of pharaohs, of great leaders, but you do not find one single edifice concerning Abraham. Abraham was the patriarch, that's for sure. But he was just one single person. Yet, God, the God of the universe, chose to call himself the God of that single person. How would you like the God of the universe to be known as the God of James Smith? That the whole world knows this God of heaven and earth as the God of James Smith. That means that God has done a lot of work in James Smith. That makes him the God of James Smith. You know, recently, the Israel Museum has asked some of us to translate some of their materials and artifacts. And in translating them, we came across a lot of these Canaanite gods. I think there's at least 20 of them. And they're God of the sun, they're God of fertility, they're the God of fire. You know, in the Old Testament you have Moloch, which is the God of fire, and you have Baal, the God of the sun, Asheroth, the God of fertility. You have God of cities, but in all the ancient writings, you do not find a God of a single person. It's only in the Bible that you find that this God chooses to call himself the God not of some grand phenomenon or some great geographical location or some big cities, but the God of a single person. And there is a lot of significance to that. Now I want to say something about this matter, and then I'll come to the outline, and I'll tell you this, that this outline comes from this book called The History of God in His Union with Man. And there's chapter 8 of it, and the outline, the chapter 7. And the outline here is just taken from this chapter. And it has 18 points. And when we go through those 18 points, then we go through the whole message and we get a panoramic view of the God of Abraham. But before that, I still want to dwell on this matter first, that this God is called the God of Abraham. I wish that when I come to the end of my life, that God can be called my God. You know, there's this hymn that we sang at the beginning of tonight, 671. It's a hymn written by M.E. Barber. And it's one of the favorite hymns of Brother Lee. And when Brother Lee came to the last part of his life, there was one time that he gathered all his children and grandchildren together, and he asked them to sing the song. And he said, this song described my life. And if you look at this song, it's just the experience of a person of this God. And he, in this case, she, has such an subjective experience of this God that she is able to say, my God. No, I'll read a few lines with you. It says, deep down into the depths of this thy name, my God. Can you say today that God is your God? It says, my God, I sing and dwell in calm delight. Then verse 2 says, thou art my God, the all-sufficient one. And then verse 3 said, for me, thy trusting one, my God, I dare once more to fling myself upon thy breast. You may say that the whole life of Brother Lee is an experience of my God, his God. And you can say the same thing for Abraham, that for his whole life, his experience was the experience of his God. Now, some of us, we were born into Christian families, and some of us were born into families where our parents, our grandparents are in the church. And you grew up, and you can say that the God is the God of my father. Or you can say the God is the God of my grandfather. But I hope that one day you can say that the God of my father and the God of my grandfather is also my God. By the way, let me just find out. How many of you are second generation, or third generation, or fourth generation? Or maybe some of you fifth generation too, from the Far East. If you are, please stand up. Let's take a look at you. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to do anything, but I hope that sometime you can say and pray, God, make me the God that is my Father, my God. You know, in Romans chapter 4, it says that Abraham knew this God to be a God who calls things not being and who called life from the dead. But that was not just to be his experience alone. It says in verse 23 and verse 24, it says, now it was not written for his sake only, but for ours too. In other words, the God that calls things not being into being and that called life from the dead, that God that Abraham experienced, is supposed to be the same God that we experience. And as I was preparing this message, this verse came to me in John chapter 20, where the Lord in his resurrection said, go tell my brother that I ascended to my Father, which is their Father. And that was the part that I enjoyed very much in the past. But as I was preparing, I enjoyed the second part. And the second part says, my God, who is their God. And I hope that we can say that the God of Abraham is my God, and the God of Jesus Christ is also my God. Now, there are 4 things I want to say about the God of Abraham. Number 1, the God of Abraham has to do with humanity. Number 2, the God of Abraham has to do with individual persons. Number 3, the God of Abraham has to do with history. And I'm going to say something about that. And then number 4, the God of Abraham has to do with the way that he deals with people. His way. I'll start with number 1 first. God, or rather, I'll start with number 2, and I'll come to number 1 later. God is the God of an individual person. He was the God of Abraham. Now let me trace some verses with you, and that is how Isaac viewed this God, and then how Jacob viewed this God, and then eventually how the children of Israel viewed this God. Well, Isaac was raised up under the shadow of his father. So when Jehovah appeared to Isaac in Genesis 26:24, he said, I am the God of Abraham, your father. In other words, I'm your dad's God. And that happens at Beersheba. And Isaac knew God as his dad's God. And then we come to Jacob. And Jacob, the first time he talked about God was when he ran away from his brother. And he was a lonely boy out in the wilderness. Then he saw the God of Abraham and Isaac. In other words, he saw his grandfather's and his father's God. And then this grandfather's God and dad's God talked to him and promised him. And then, as a pretty smart, conniving young person would do, he said, if you would give me food, if you would give me clothing, and if you are going to be with me, and if you're going to bring me safely back home, then I will make you also my God. So far, you're just my dad's God and my granddad's God. But if you do all these things to me, then I'll make you my God too. Then he ran off to his uncle Laban. And by the way, Laban his father was Nahor, and Nahor and Abraham, they were brothers. And so Jacob was the 3rd generation. He went to stay with the 2nd generation of his relatives. And Nahor had his God. And so after Jacob served him 20 years and he left, And his wife took away some of the gods. Then Laban complained, he said, "Why steal my gods?" In chapter 31:30. Then Jacob argued back. In chapter 31, verse 5 and verse 42, he said, "The God of my father, the dread of Isaac." The dread of Isaac means the one that Isaac feared. It was not yet his God. It was the God of his father, the one that Isaac feared. "He has been with me." So he invoked his dad's God. And then they finally settled the dispute. And then they had a covenant. And then Laban said, "The God of Abraham, that's your granddad's God. The God of Nahor, that's my dad's God. The God of their father, that's Terah's God. And they're probably all different gods. Judge between us." Then Jacob went back to Canaan, and he was in Shechem. And while he was in Shechem, God spoke to him. And he said, "You should make altar to the God who appeared to you." Remember that God who appeared to you when you ran away from your brother? So Jacob remembered that, packed up his whole family, and told them to put away all the foreign gods. And then he told them, he said, "Who is this God that I'm bringing you to?" In verse 3 it says, "He is the God who answered me in the days of my distress and has been with me wherever I go." So finally, Jacob had some experience of this God. He can say something about this God, that this God, He answered me in the days of my distress, and He has been with me wherever I go. You know, to the extent that you experience this God, then that God is yours. If you have zero experience, then that God remains the God of your father and your grandfather. But when you experience something a little bit more, He's a little bit more of your God. Until at the end of his life, in chapter 48:15, when he was blessing his son Joseph, he said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked." Yes, it was a God of my father, a God of my grandfather. But then he added, "This is the God who has shepherded me all my life to this day." He could add that because he had some history. He has some experience, and he had some personal knowledge of this God that previously was only his grandfather's God and his father's God. I hope that for all of us who came to the Lord's recovery through your parents, through your grandparents, would be able to say one day that this God is my God. Hymn number 600, the first word says, "My God." It's not a small thing to be able to say, "My God." So that's the first thing that I want to say, and that is, God is not a God of the universe only. He is a personal God. He is the God of Abraham. And then, as Jacob experienced him, then he became the God of Jacob. And by the time of Moses, when Moses saw the burning bush, God said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. There's some experience of God in all three of them, so that God was able to say that he was the God, both the grandfather and the son, and the grandson. In saying that, if you read the note of Exodus 3:6, where it talks about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob, it indicates three things. Number one, that this God of Abraham is a God of covenant. There's some experience there. It's not a blank. Number two, it's the God of resurrection. That's, of course, the Lord Jesus' interpretation of what Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob means. Then, he is the triune God. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That's my name. And then, God said from the burning bush, you go to the children of Israel and declare to them the God of their people. And who is this God of their people? In chapter 3, verse 15, it says, Jehovah is his name, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then listen to what it says after that. This is my name forever. This is my memorial from generation to generation. In other words, if you want to know God, you have to know God by this designation. He is the God who is experienced by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whom God has done something in their lives. This is his name forever. Of those personal experiences that make God their God, this is his name forever. And this is the memorial. You know, in all the ancient nations, they have gods. God of this nation, God of that nation. With the people of God, the children of Israel. You know, that God is the God of individuals, three persons. It's very interesting. Now, one more thing, and I'll go to the next point. In Joshua chapter 24, at the end of the Canaanite conquest, Joshua brought all the children of Israel to Shechem, and there renew the vows that they had with God. And it's a chapter on serving the right God. It began with saying that your fathers served other gods across the river. Verse 2. And then it says, then you went through Egypt, then you went into the wilderness, and then you came to the good land. You went through all these experiences. And then in verse 14, he said, now, put away the gods whom your fathers served across the river and in Egypt. Serve this one God. Then verse 15, choose whom you will serve. Either those gods from across the river, or the gods of the Ammonites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve Jehovah. We will serve our God. Then the children of Israel responded. Verse 17, Jehovah, our God. Finally, they attached that pronoun. That this God is not just the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now he is our God. We have made him our God. Jehovah, our God, is the one who brought us from Egypt. Then verse 18, we will serve Jehovah, for he is our God. Now this God that was just the patriarchs is now our God. Verse 24, after Joshua said, no, you can't do that. You're going to be not faithful. Then the children of Israel said, Jehovah, our God, we will serve, and to his voice we will listen. Then Joshua enacted a stone, and that stone is still there. It's in a place called El Balata in the city of Shechem, which today is called Nablus. And a few times I brought some saints over there, and that stone is still there. And some of the families, they got together, 2 generations, 3 generations, and they consecrated themselves to serve their God. We want all the houses and all the families to come together and have a corporate consecration. That the God would not just be somebody else's God, would not just be the God of the Bible, but it would be our God. As for me and my house, we will serve Jehovah. Verse 27 says, this stone shall be a witness against us, lest you act deceptively against your God. That's what Joshua said. So much to give you an impression of this God, the God of Abraham. Now, the next thing I want to say is that this God revealed himself in history. He doesn't reveal himself through doctrines, through propositions. He revealed himself through history. In fact, the whole Bible, the majority of it, is history. Or you may say story. And that actually is what happened to us. That we know God through history. You know, Brother Lee one time had 28 messages. And those 28 messages were relating the history of the Lord's recovery in the past 60 years. And there were a lot of stories. But Brother Lee said at the beginning, he said, I'm not just telling stories. Through the stories, there is the revelation. It is through the stories that you get the revelation. And you may say that the entire Old Testament is stories. And when we go through those 18 points, they are actually stories. But it is through those stories that God revealed himself. God is a God of history. God reveals himself through history. God speaks through history. You know, in the Crystallization of the Gospel of John, it says that in chapter 1 of the Gospel of John, where it says that he is the Word as God's definition and God's explanation. How did he speak? He did not speak through the air. He spoke through 5 historical events. In the historical events, God unfolds himself. That's why in Hebrews chapter 1 verse 1 it says, God in the old days, in many portions and in many ways, through the history of the patriarchs, through the stories, through all the happenings that happened to people individually and corporately, God spoke. It was in all those acts that God spoke to man. God speaks through history. God reveals himself through history. God works through history. God moves through history. And God's will is accomplished through history. The question is, do you have a history with God? Do you have a history with God? Young people, maybe your parents have a history with God. Do you have a history with God? And I told you that this book was where this outline is from. And I'd like to read you the beginning of this book to give you a sense why Brother Lee wants to give this title. The title is The History of God. God's history is not written in fables, myths. It's written in the experiences and the history of every single one of you. James, do you have a history with God? If you do, then God is your God. Maybe you have a history of 1 year. Maybe you have a history of 5 years. It doesn't mean that you're a Christian for 30 years, then you have 30 years history. Maybe you're a Christian for 30 years, you only have 1 year history. You know, in 1 John, it says that the young people, they overcame. Their sins are forgiven. Or the children, their sins are forgiven. The young people, they overcome the world. But the fathers, what happened to the fathers? They know the one that is in the beginning. In other words, the fathers are the ones that have the history. My brothers and sisters, do you have a history? Do we, each one of us, individually, have a history with God? Let me just read a few sentences from the beginning of this book. The living, purposeful, active, and acting God surely needs a history, a biography. Then Brother Lee said, I just recently finished writing the biography of Watchman Nee. So Watchman Nee has a history. And that history was not just a romantic history, it's a heroic history. It's a history about God. And that's why when you read that biography, the Seer of the Divine Revelation, it's not like any biography that you read. It's a history of God working in man. It's a special kind of history. And that is the only kind of history that counts. I wish myself, and I wish you, would have more of this kind of history. The Bible is the biography of God, the history of God. Actually, we may say the Bible is the autobiography of God. Now, it's a history of God, but it's a history that is linked up with us. In other words, while we are writing our history, God is writing His history. But it depends on whether the history that we write is in union with God, or whether it is just writing from the White House, writing from Wall Street, writing from everything else except God. If that writing has to do with God, then it is both our history and the history of God. We have to know God's history because history, His history, has everything to do with us. God's history has become our history because He is in union with us. Now, before I pass on to another point, let me just read you one thing. And that is, Brother Ni asks, do you have a spiritual history? That's in the chapter Numbering Our Days. It says, do you have a spiritual history? Today, among us, some may be quite old. Some may even have grandchildren. You may be 60 years of age, but have had only 1 month before the Lord. Or you may be 20 years of age and have had only 10 years before the Lord. You may have believed in Him for 5 years, but that does not mean that you are 5 years old. Please remember that the number of years is one thing, the age is another thing. How many days do we have before God? This is a matter of utmost importance. Ask ourselves, how many days do I have in the sight of God? In other words, how much history can I write? When you get to the tomb, and then people write on your tombstone, they're writing your history. How much history can people write? This person was a great man in the world. That was all. But with these ones, they had a history before God. Amen. Okay, now let's come to the outline, and I can finish that. It talks about how this God reveals Himself to man. And He reveals to man in 5 ways. Number 1, in appearing to man. And there are 4 appearings. Number 2, in speaking to man. And there are 12 speakings. Number 3, in calling man. And there's 2 callings. Number 4, in giving man a vision. And there's 1 vision. And then there's 6 other things. Those 6 other things are neither God speaking, nor God's appearing, nor God's calling, nor God's vision. Well, what were those? Those were all things, including the failure things. The failures. That means God revealed Himself and write history not just through His direct speaking, but also through His indirect working. Of those 6 times that you count, where there was no direct speaking, 3 times were failures. 1 time, Abraham went and betrayed his wife in Egypt. 1 time, he begot Ishmael. 1 time, and that's it. After he got into fellowship with God and interceded for Lot, then he fell again. And when he went to this place called Gerar, G-E-R-A-R, and he did exactly the same thing. And you know what? While all that was going on, God was still writing His history. But, of course, there was no history of Abraham. Abraham, for 13 years, his history stopped. But God was still writing. We'll come to that. Okay, let's come to the outline. And I suggest, if you want to or One way you can go through this outline with me is to turn to the book of Genesis, to the outline. Because in the outline, it gives you a subject of all these things that we talk about. Now, like I said, there are altogether 4 appearings, 12 speakings, and 2 callings. And all of them happen in 4 stages. And it describes the 4 stages of Abraham's history. The first stage was coming out of Ur of Chaldea and of Haran. That's when he knew God as the God of glory. The second stage, you have actually a message in the life study that describes these four stages. First stage is Abraham experienced him as the God of glory in calling him out. Second stage is the stage when he experienced God by living by faith, and God took care of all his daily necessities. And that's chapter 13 and 14. That is the third speaking and the fourth speaking. Stage 2. In Bethel, in Shechem, and then in Bethel. The second stage. What is that second stage? The second stage is when God took care of his living. He took care of his living, of course, by blessing him, but he took care of his living by Abraham learning to live by faith. Learning to live by faith. Then you move on to the third stage, and that's starting from chapter 15. Up till that point, it was all taken care of Abraham's living. Then chapter 15 verse 1, it says, after these things. And there's a footnote there. In chapter 15:1, it says, prior to all these things, prior to chapter 15, Abraham experienced God as the one who protected him and blessed him in material things to maintain his existence outwardly. Beginning here, beginning in chapter 15, verse 1. That is beginning from the fifth speaking in Hebrew. He needed God's grace inwardly to fulfill God's purpose. Then God told him, you're going to have a seed. And then he tried to have the seed by himself, and then it failed. And then he realized that he needed to take grace. And when that happened in chapter 17, then God told him that he is the El Shaddai. He is the all-sufficient one. The all-sufficient one for you, not to take care of your living, all-sufficient one to make you able to fulfill God's purpose. The all-sufficient El Shaddai. And some of us, we know, oh, that was such a wonderful speaking, the El Shaddai. A cow with an udder, and it keep coming. Well, the coming is not just to take care of our daily living. It's not even just to take care of our joy, our peace. It's so that we would fulfill God's purpose, not by ourselves. He is the all-sufficient one that will take care of all the need for us to fulfill his purpose. That's why right after that it says, I am the all-sufficient one, walk before me. Walk before me and be perfect. In other words, it has nothing to do with taking care of your living. It has to do with you fulfilling God's purpose. That's third stage. So Abraham, he moved from stage 1, which was just a calling out, crossed the river, to stage 2, which was to live by faith to take care of his living, to stage 3, which is to learn to live by grace to take care of God's purpose, and from there move on to stage 4, which begins from the 8th speaking in Hebron in chapter 18. And in chapter 18, he moved on to another realm, another kind of experience, another stage. That was what we had in the last message with Brother Minoru, and that is, he moved on to the stage of having fellowship with God on the human level and making intercessions with God. In this first stage, he's the God of glory. In the second stage, he's the God of the Most High. In the third stage, he's the God of all sufficiency, the El Shaddai. In the fourth stage, he is the God that comes in as a man. How wonderful. Well, let's move quickly through this outline. The God of Abraham is the God of glory. In his first appearing with his first calling and his first speaking to Abraham as the vast magnet and the great motivation to Abraham that moved him to come out of the country of satanic idolatry. 1, through his repeated appearing to Abraham, God transfused himself into him, causing him to experience a spiritual infusion. 2, Abraham was able to reach Canaan because God was persistent. God holds his people fast. He is a God who will not let go. 3, God was revealed to Abraham as the justifier of his believing people who have been transfused with him as their believing element to be their faith, which is their appreciation of him as a divine reaction to his attraction. So that's the first speaking. And in the first speaking, who appeared? It's the God of glory, not the glory of God. You know, in Genesis chapter 1, what you have is the glory of God, the creation of God. But when you come to chapter 12, you have one person. Not only does he know the Creator, he knows God himself in his being. Which one would you like? To know the glory of God or to know the God of glory? You know, some time ago, I took a tape from the library, and it talks about Jonathan Edwards, and it says, oh, this man is so pious, so godly. Even when he was young, he would walk into the woods for hours and hours and contemplate on the glory of God. And he would pray and he would even cry. Well, that's wonderful. But you know what that is? That is just appreciating the glory of God. But Abraham, he saw the God of glory. He saw God himself. And it was, you know, the glory of God doesn't attract you. It's the God of glory that attracts you. He attracts you. His appearing is his attracting. He doesn't chase you. He attracts you. When I was in high school, you know, I took an English class, and they said there's one poem that says, the hound of heaven. So there's a hound at start, and he's chasing you around, chasing you until you have nowhere to go, then you have to go to God. Well, God doesn't chase you. He attracts you. He calls you like a big magnet. And sometimes you don't respond, but that power is still there. It's the God of glory that appears to Abraham that attracts him like a great magnet. But he got stuck. And so he was in Haran. And so we come to the second appearing. Second appearing was God appearing to him in Haran. He got stuck there, and so what did he do? God gave him a lot of stuff. You know, the first time when God spoke to him, it was very short. It was just one sentence. Come out from your land and from your relatives and come into the land which I will show you. That's all. In the second, when he got stuck, God spoke to him at least 4 or 5 things. Okay. Go from the land to the land that I will show you, number 1. I'll make you a great nation, number 2. I'll make your name great, number 3. You shall be a blessing, number 4. Whoever blesses you will be blessed, whoever curses you will be cursed. And then, number 5, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, are you going to still get stuck in Haran or not? So, Abraham, in the outline it says, this attracted Abraham. Wow! What a prize! So then he moved on to go into the good land of the divine promise. 1. According to Galatians 3:14, the blessing promised here is actually God himself as the Spirit, the greatest blessing at the triune God, the Father, Son, and Spirit, as the process, all-inclusive, life-giving Spirit, dwelling in us in the most subjective way for our enjoyment. So that was the promise that was given in Haran. 2, whoever curses God's people receive a curse. Whoever blesses God's people receive a blessing. Wow, that's great. If God said to me, whoever curses you, he's going to be cursed. Whoever blesses you, he's going to be blessing. I said, wow, amen. But you know what? That's exactly what happened to the nation of Israel. Whoever curses them, they get cursed. Whoever blesses them, they get blessing. Okay. That's the second one. Then we may move to stage 2, where he's already in the land, and now he has to live by faith. So that's C. The God of Abraham is the God of the earth. He has the whole earth. In his second appearing with his third speaking, in promising Abraham that he would give the land of Canaan to his seed. I'm not just going to make you rich. I'm going to give you this whole land. Then, guess what? Right in the middle of it, boom, he fell. You know, I mentioned about 4 stages, right? You know, it so happened in each of those 4 stages, Abraham stumbled. In the first stage, he stumbled in Haran. In the second stage, he stumbled in Egypt. In the third stage, he stumbled with Ishmael. And in the 4th stage, he stumbled by getting into Gerar and committed the same error again. And the recovery version called it the hidden weakness. There's still some weakness, even when he got to stage 4. I remember when I was young, I attended one brother. He gave a conference on Abraham, and he drew a chart. He said, it's like this. Go around, boom, go down again. Boom, go down again. Boom, go down again. Boom, go down again. You know what? That's you and me. That's human. And in this human, God writes his history. Right in the midst of our failure. And that's what we come to, the next point. Point D. The God of Abraham is the God of secret care. There is no speaking for sure when Abraham traded his wife. No, he betrayed his wife. But God was still doing something. He was exercising his secret care for his elect. And if you read that story, you know how God sovereignly just kicked Abraham out of that place. And he got out of that place. It ought to be pretty shameful, but he got out of that place with a lot of riches. That's how God cares for you and me. Then the next one. The God of Abraham is the God of comfort and encouragement. So, Lot separated from him. He got his nephew who was following him all the time. Now he's gone. Now Abraham was alone. And by the way, you know, Lot, he followed Abraham, but he never took Abraham's God as his God. And the name Lot, do you know what it means? It means a veil. So he never saw the God of Abraham. He just follow along, and then it comes to a point, and then boom, he saw something much nicer, more material, and then he left. So Abraham was left alone, and he was lonely. So the God of Abraham is the God of comfort, encouragement, and his forespeaking after Lot left Abraham in promising to give Abraham and to his seed the land of Canaan as far as he could see in 4 directions, and to make his seed as numerous as the dust of the earth. So point number 1 is on seed. Point number 2 is on the land. So God spoke to him by comfort and encouragement by promising him the seed and the land. Christ as the seed of Abraham must be wrought into us so that he may be brought forth through us for his increase. The land of Canaan signifies the all-inclusive Christ as the all-inclusive Spirit in our spirit for our enjoyment, so that we may be constituted with him for his corporate expression. Now, we covered these points in some of the previous messages, and so we will not cover them, except that I will just say that this is God's comfort and encouragement in Hebron when he was left by himself. Then the next point, and it happens after Abraham, he went and he fought for his brother. You had a message on that. So he took his 318 men and he fought for his brother. And then he said, I don't need any of the gift from the king of Sodom because God takes care of me. He's the God of the Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth. So now he learned the lesson of faith. But it's a faith that takes care of his own living. The God of Abraham is the Most High, God the Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, in his divine supply with his blessing to Abraham through his priest Melchizedek after Abraham fought the battle against the 4 kings. Then we move to stage 3. After these things, after he has the experience of learning to live by faith to take care of his living, then he moved to the next one, and that is in chapter 15. In chapter 15, it says, do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward. In his 5th speaking, this time in a vision. Now, this time, this speaking is 2 speakings. The first speaking is concerning the seed, that is in G. The second speaking is concerning the land, that is in H. And it's in the same time span in chapter 15, the beginning of it. The first part, he spoke in a vision to Abraham when he was afraid of the 4 kings avenging, in pointing out to Abraham that his heavenly seed in their divine nature would be as many as the stars in the heavens, who could never be touched by anyone on earth. Abraham believed in Jehovah, and Jehovah accounted it to him as righteousness. James had a good message on that. And so that was God's speaking to him. And then, following that, he was able to believe in the seed, but he couldn't believe in the land, and so God made a covenant with him. And that was the covenant of Genesis 15, which is a precursor of the new covenant. The God of Abraham is the God of faithfulness, in foretelling to Abraham in his 6th speaking to him in his deep sleep that his earthly seed in their human nature would be sojourners in Egypt, serve the Egyptians, be afflicted by them for 400 years, and in their 4th generations return to Canaan. And he is the God of faithfulness in making a covenant with him that he would give to his seed the land from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. So that is the let me see. I get lost. Yeah, that is the 6th speaking. That is 6 speaking. Okay, now, the 7 speaking. The 7 speaking is J. But before J, you have I. And that is no speaking. No speaking is still part of God's history. You know what? When God keeps silent, there's something going on. You better do something. It's very meaningful that God says something. It's very meaningful that God doesn't say anything. And God's not speaking is as significant as God's speaking. So anyway, God didn't speak 13 years because he was not pleased, because he exercised the flesh. Okay, the God of Abraham is the God of silence. That's one aspect of our God. Sometimes he can be silent. That's our God. Due to the fact that Abraham listened to his wife Sarah and married Hagar to get a son by the exercise of his flesh when he was 86 years old, then God became silent to Abraham for 13 years until he became 99 years old, and God appeared to him again. Then the next point is God speaking again in chapter 17. That's after the test and after he has learned to fulfill God's purpose not by his own effort, but by grace. After that, then God came in. It says, when Abraham was 99 years old, then there's a revelation of God's name and there's a changing of his name. It says, God's name, I am the El Shaddai, that will fulfill my purpose, not by you, but by me, as the one with the all-sufficient other, whose fulfillment is the all-inclusive, bountiful supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. He, instead of your own puny little flesh, will fulfill God's purpose. Walk before me and be perfect. Then change your name. No longer Abram, but Abraham. And your wife, no longer Sarai, but Sarah. That's the El Shaddai. Okay, J. The God of Abraham is the God of all sufficiency in his third appearing, with his seventh speaking to Abraham in being the God of circumcision, to cut off his chosen people's natural man in the flesh, that they may become God's new creation, signified by Isaac, who was born by God's grace, not by Ishmael, who was born by Abraham's flesh. Now, then there's 4 wonderful points about the El Shaddai. God is revealed as the all-sufficient God, El Shaddai, for his believing ones to walk in his presence, constantly enjoying him and his all-sufficient supply, and to have God added to them as the element and factor of their perfection. 2. The divine title El Shaddai is composed of 2 Hebrew words, El meaning the mighty one, and Shaddai comes from the Hebrew word meaning breast or other. 3. Thus, God is the mighty one with an other, the all-sufficient mighty one, to be the nourisher, strength giver, and bountiful supplier of his called ones, who continually receive him to fulfill his purpose. 4. The all-sufficient God is the God of crucifixion for the termination of our natural man in the flesh, and the God of resurrection for the germination of our new man for the new creation. It is only after that that Abraham knew God as the God that calls things not being into being, and the God that calls life from the dead. And it is only after this that God appeared to Abraham with new names. Number 1 here, you have El Shaddai. Then afterwards, in Beersheba, there is the El Olam, the eternal one. And then in Mount Moriah, there was the Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. He advanced. He knew God more by a more richer name. Then next one. Move to stage 4. Stage 4, God appearing as a man in his fellowship with man. The God of Abraham is the God with his human friendship in his coming, his 4th appearing with his 8th speaking to Abraham as a man, in the form of a man, to visit Abraham as his friend on the level of humanity, with whom Abraham walked, and who conversed with Abraham as a human friend with a human friend concerning his judgment of Sodom, where his friend's nephew Lot and his family live. So that was covered by Minoru in the last message. Then, next one. Again, this one has no speaking. It's God's sovereign care in writing his own history. The God of Abraham is the God with friendship in humanity in sending Abraham's nephew, that is Lot, and his 2 daughters out from the outthrow of Sodom, from the remembrance of Abraham as his intimate friend. So God took care of that. All things work together for good of those who are called. Who's called? Abraham was called. All things work together. In the same way, all things work together for us. You know, whether God speaks to you or God is not speaking to you, he's working all things together for those who are called. And those who are called, he justified them. And those that are justified, he glorified them. Amen. Next one. The God of Abraham is the Almighty God with his friendly care in saving his close friend Abraham with his almighty power from the loss of his wife to Abimelech, king of Gerar. That's a shameful hidden weakness and shameful intercession. There was a glorious intercession for Lot. Here there was a shameful intercession for the king of Gerar, Abimelech, because he has no child, and Abraham himself, he was in this terrible situation, and he had no child yet at that time, but he prayed for Abimelech, and Abimelech had child, and then somehow God in his sovereignty just got him out. And so that was another point of God's care, friendly care. Then, next one, important. Then he came back, and then, after he came back to Beersheba. Now, Jehovah visited Sarah as his handmaid, and Sarah conceived. So finally, Sarah had a child. And after Sarah had a child, the child was being raised up in Beersheba. And Beersheba, where Abraham, he had a covenant with Abimelech, and so that well was called the well of the 7 lamps. And there, listen, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree, and there he called on the name of El-Olam. And the God of Abraham is the God of changelessness, in keeping the principle of his grace in recognizing Isaac, his son of Sarah, and his only son, in his 9th speaking. Now, then, we come to the end. Finally, in the offering up of Isaac in chapter 22. First, there was a speaking in Beersheba to tell Abraham to offer up his son Isaac. Then Abraham took his son to Mount Moriah. Then the last 2 speakings are up on Mount Moriah. Listen, isn't that wonderful? God started his speaking in Ur of Chaldea, and he ended up his speaking on Mount Moriah. Would you like your life to be like that? Started out speaking to you from the bar, while you're in the bar. God called you out of that bar. And you ended up in Mount Moriah at the end of your life. And God spoke to you. Amen. So the last 3. The God of Abraham is the triune God of... not yet. The God of Abraham is the God with his trial, in proving Abraham his intimate human friend by asking him to present his only son whom he loved for a burnt offering to him in his 10th speaking to Abraham. Then P, when they got up to Mount Moriah, then the God of Abraham, he spoke again. He's the triune God of provision in his providing a ram to replace Isaac for a burnt offering to him as the angel of Jehovah Christ in his 11th speaking to Abraham. Then finally, the God of Abraham is the triune God of blessing in his 12th last speaking to Abraham, promising him that he, as the angel of Jehovah Christ, would bless him and multiply his seed like the stars of the heavens and like the sands upon the seashore, and that in his seed, Christ, would all the nations of the earth be blessed. What did he say? I'll just read you. Chapter 22, verse 16 to 18. By myself I have sworn, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and will greatly multiply your seed like the stars of heavens and like the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gates of his enemies. And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. That's the last speaking in the life of Abraham. Do you think that that is a full life? Don't you think that that is a full life? It's not full, and his name were not written on the temples, and his images were not carved on the cliffs, but his history is written in the divine history of a man who failed in every stage of his life and start from zero and go all the way to the top. All the way when he was in Ur of Chaldea, when the God of glory appeared to him, until he offered his only begotten son on Mount Moriah. That is the God of Abraham. I hope it can be your God too. I hope it can be my God too. Finally, the last point. The last point is not God speaking. I got my pages all mixed up now. Let me find my page. Okay, here it is. The last point. The last point. The God of Abraham is the God of friendship on the human level, in leading the old servant of his friend Abraham to secure a wife for his son Isaac. In this, God dealt with Abraham in the way that causes the servant to worship the Lord. And I would try to end it this way, that the title of this message is The God of Abraham in his dealing with Abraham. First, God's history involves himself. Second, God's history involves his dealing with man. And the way he deals with man is his way with man. And we have to know God, and we have to know his way on how he deals with man. And as Abraham looked back, he could say, I know God, and I know his ways. I worship God, and I worship his ways. There's a book by Watchman Nee called Worshipping the Ways of God. A man who knows God not only worships God, but he worships his way. And what is his way? His way is the way that he deals with us. As Abraham looked back, he would remember how God dealt with him in Haran. He would remember how God dealt with him when he went down to Egypt. He would remember how God dealt with him when he just disobeyed God and took Hagar for his wife. He would remember how God dealt with him when he went down and he failed. He would remember how God dealt with him when he became faithful. He would remember all these dealings. And all these dealings, when you add them one by one, one by one, one by one, is God's ways. My brothers, do we know God's way? Do we know God's way in us? You know, Amy Barber in the hymn, in the last line it says, adoring his ways. She is a person who knows how to worship the ways of God. I hope we will all be such person, so that the God of Abraham would not just be the God of Abraham, but it would be my God. And I hope that when we come to the end of our life, we can say the same thing that Abraham said, and the same thing that Brother Lee said, that this is our God, this is my God. I hope that this message will give you a blessing. Now, the end, as a conclusion. So I mentioned at the beginning, how do we know God? How does God reveal himself to us? Number one, by his appearing. Number two, by his speaking. The speaking is the main thing, 12 times. Appearing is at the beginning to just draw you, 4 times. Then his calling, 2 times. Then his vision, 1 time. And then what he does in the environment, 6 times. As a human being, in his humanity. So, Roman numeral 2, as a whole, the God of Abraham is the God of speaking, in his appearing, with calling, in a vision, in human friendship, to unveil to his intimate friend on the earth what he aspired for him to be and what he wanted him to do, according to his heart's desire for the accomplishment of the eternal economy for the divine Trinity. It was just one small man, but yet he was the God that he knew became the God of all generations throughout the entire earth afterwards. Just because this man, he wrote a history with God. Amen. May the Lord bless us. Let's pray 2 by 2.